Hello, Tordread here. Today, we've got a video going over some standard gameplay for once, actually. And I had a Masters League game, which is the tournament that Mings is holding right now with the top, I think, 64 or something. I think it's 64 standard players on the ladder. And this is one of those super classic maps, Hope Forlorn. And my opponent is one of the best standard players of all time, Jokas. He's been around for a really long time. He doesn't play a lot of games, but he's a very sharp player and has a lot of good insights. Actually, in this game, I talked with him before reviewing this game, and he had a lot of insight that's very useful. And there's a lot of meat to this game that you can really get into and learn a lot of different concepts from this game. So that was why I picked it to review. Because not only is it a pretty interesting game, it's a Max versus Olaf matchup where Max is like, you got to be on the offensive and really pushing and being proactive, and Olaf is a lot more stally. A Hope Forlorn is typically a more stally map, so you see a lot more Olaf, a lot more Eagle in Tier 2, but um, I love playing the aggressive side of a lot of these matchups, so I picked Max, kind of hoping for an Eagle matchup. Um, so I think the matchup is a little bit Olaf favored. Um, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how the map plays out to start. So you've got two bases for red on the top, and you got one on the bottom. But the thing about this bottom base is that it is blocked off by a massive mountain chain that prohibits any vehicles from getting into that you build on your weak side from getting onto the middle or the top of the map. You can see that the path they would have to take takes them right over these sort of plains over here. And this is directly in range, two-turn range of two bases from the blue player, so on their strong side. So first off, it's very easy to build like an infantry wall in like a diagonal or in a straight line that prevents tanks from being able to get into good positions. Second, you can build a medium tank from the two base side and it will ward off most vehicles on your weak side that you would have. There is an airport on the weak side, so that is a nice alternative to use because you can use it to protect your weak side, but you can also go over those mountains and get into the middle. And the middle is very important. There's these three contested properties in the center that don't really belong to anyone, and that can be a pretty big income shift. There's two properties in the mountains that seem sort of more like they belong to one player than they really do, because you might think like blue goes for like a chain here and then would like go for this property, but it's very heavily in the two bases side. It might be possible to get infantry from the weak side there quicker, but there's a lot more pressure coming in with the two bases to defend this position. So typically this is a red property and this is a blue property. So there's a couple ways this map can play out. You can have sort of a two base like assaults the weak side and you really push in for stuff, like you can go for the comm tower, you can go for this property over here, and try to get like a small lead. But realistically, you're mostly going to be sort of like building up a wall and trying to slow push for the center, because the center really is very important in this map, as you have a disconnected front over here. So if you can sort of push yourself onto these like three properties here, you also give yourself a little bit more threat of using the center to create sort of like a threat on the back side, and you can try to bring together both fronts. So you can push on the bottom here, and then you're threatening to pincer attack at the same time. So let's get into this match to start off. So typical infantry builds. One thing to note is that Jokas actually goes for the property on the back here because it prevents a day 3 max recon from being able to potentially interrupt a property cap here that would not be able to be interacted with, but like protected with a tank. So goes for a back cap first before going for the chain. Day 3, I see this, so instead of going for a recon, I go for an infantry. So now builds more infantry. Day 4 rolls in, capping the properties, and go for that back cap. And I go for a recon on this day. Now, this is sort of like one of those changes in sort of like how I want to approach this game. I wanted to use this recon to go here and then potentially go up to this point and threaten to interrupt this cap because he wouldn't be able to get there in time to stop the recon from interrupting. Or the recon can go down to the center and apply some pressure there. And I was thinking, maybe I go up here, force a tank, come back down, and then I can, I could still keep applying pressure with it. But one thing to note is income curves are a very important concept in standard play. And by going for this recon, I actually kind of mess up my income curve. You can see that on my next turn, I have 7,000 income, and I have 1,000 in the bank. So that'll mean I'll have 8,000 on the next turn, and that's 1,000 less than I need to go for a tank and double infantry build. Now, the problem with that, first off, this recon, it is pretty almost certain to interrupt at least a little bit of Jokas' income, but I also give up on income myself, because if I had built an infantry, I could go 1, 2, 3 here, and then I could cap the property right here, and that would be like an income swing for myself. So I'm sort of denying myself at the same time as I'm trying to go for some aggressive plays because I'm max and I want to go for some aggression. But it's important to get those income curves correct, because next turn I'll have 8,000, so I'll most likely be forced into a triple infantry build, which is pretty weak on day 5. And I won't have the first vehicle in play, so Jokas will most likely get a tank out onto the center field faster than I will, and then I kind of lose that advantage of being able to pressure on the map a lot faster. So day 4, Jokas caps that back property, goes for an APC, which I'm not an APC person, but APC here makes a lot of sense because this infantry would take 1, 2, 3, 4 turns to get into a useful position, because this cap is already covered, and probably one of these caps is already covered. So it changes this infantry from being useful in 4 turns to being useful in 2 turns, because the APC can drop it off on one of these tiles, and it can go for a much more important cap than just like walking all the way. So I kind of like this, and it also allows for more efficient builds in the future and could be a decent blocker against Max. So not bad, but you got to know what you're doing with APCs when you use them. So I kind of just prefer vehicles over APCs. So have to go for that triple infantry build. And you can see that, again, it kind of screws up my income curve, because now I'm going to have 13k, and with Max you can't really go for any artillery builds. So with 13k I can only go for 1 tank and some infantry. And I'm leaving a lot of income not used on every turn, which is really delaying sort of my power and ability to pressure. And Jokas is playing it a lot smarter, because you can see he hits the 9,000 directly, and he also caps 2 properties, so he'll have 9,000 on the next turn to go for another tank and double infantry. So his builds are just way more efficient in how he can get value onto the board. Day 6, go for this recon up here so that I can prevent a cap on the following turn, force a tank on the weak side. And then I go for a tank on my weak side, which you don't really want to do when you're going for these maps where you have disconnected fronts. because this tank cannot reach the center. And I want to have the most power in the center as I can. So it's much better to wait for this tank to commit onto my weak side before building it, and then just play a little bit more passive than anticipating that the tank will go over to my weak side and I will need something immediately to defend it. One tank at the start is not that bad, but you'll see this kind of snowballs out of control, and I don't have any pressure on my strong side, which is kind of bad because it doesn't really sync up that well with this recon being out on the field. Okay, so day 7 comes in, and I'm definitely posturing in this position to go for this property, which is not mine, and it's also on my weak side, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to go for that, but that ends up being what I kind of go for. I think I was a little bit, I wasn't thinking too much about, I thought this was my own property when I was playing the game, and maybe just overestimated the power of Max in terms of just like brawling out for it. Because what I end up doing is I end up going for a second tank on my weak side. So like I'm really heavily committing to getting this property, and with a tank chain here, I'm setting up a turn where he can't interrupt this without losing a tank. So it makes a little bit of sense in the short term, but long term, even if I do get this property, it's probably unlikely to hold it for a long time, and then I have tanks over here that can't really invest into the most important fronts. So Jokas gets some caps done. He's had a much more efficient capture game because of this APC, and there hasn't been any super strong punish for it. It's just sort of been able to get the backward caps into better positions. So I'm liking how he's going with it so far. Moves up that infantry to be threatening both the middle caps. So I have to have something to respond to that. I do a bunch of capping, move up my tank into the forest, like inviting the tank to hit because I have the tank chain. So that's the only tile that he could attack the infantry, so I'm going to get that cap on the contested property in the mountains. He builds up a mech here and then brings the APC over so that he can ferry this. So because he has this APC, he was able to build a very efficient build on the last turn. So he was able to utilize all his funds. So when you see that build, he got down to 0. So he went for a tank, a mech, and an infantry with 11k. So the APC is paying off in terms of builds, because without it, probably would go for an infantry, because mechs are just way too slow without an APC to support them. So I get the capture off here. And here is where I make a small inaccuracy. I wouldn't even call it small, it's pretty bad, is that both of these tanks here are not in range to support defending this infantry because of the forests. So I wasn't thinking about it too much in the game, and probably putting a tank on this road would have been much better, because now Jokas can actually go for a really strong play here where he hits both these infantry onto that and weakens my defense of this sort of forward city that I got by quite a lot. And he's able to posture tanks in a way from his strong bases that they can easily shift towards the center, but they're also sort of defending this, pressuring the weak side. Moves the mech down here to support the most forward tank so that deters getting any hits onto it. So do some more caps. Go for my own mountain city over here. And going for another center property. As Max, I really want to push getting those center properties, but it's been a lot harder for me because of how many active tanks. I only have 2 active tanks in the center, and Jokas has 4. I mean, these 2 are they're 1 turn away, but he can really pressure a lot with the tanks he has all sort of grouped up rather than split up the way that I have, because I have like a recon that has been at this point just a little bit of harassment in terms of economy, but not that much. I have to try and find some ways to get some value out of it in the future, but right now it hasn't done too much. I get an infantry kill over here, and then I move my tanks back to defensive positions. So they ended up sort of just taking a bad trade, and right here is something to note, especially for many other maps and many other games, is when you have a disconnected front, you do not want to be building tanks like this, because right now Jokas has all his tanks here in very middle positions. They haven't committed into assaulting the weak side. They're in a very flexible position. So I shouldn't be heavily reacting with a tank. I should be going with an infantry on here and then building up my strong side much more. The fact I already have 2 tanks down here is a little bit of a problem, and that I overextended for this property was definitely not a good move. I should have just been looking towards creating as strong a front in the center to take these 3 properties, because they're much more easily able to be contested. So now I have 21k worth of tanks over here that if Jokas walls them out properly, they can't really do much. And he can just kind of ignore them, build up a few infantry right here, and then he will outnumber the tanks in my center by 2, because he's been only focusing on building tanks on his strong side and building infantry on his weak side. So he gets some good hits off here, and then goes for the cap on the center property there, and the cap on this mountain city that cannot be interrupted. So this is a super short lead that I had right there, and not really worth it. So my turn, I cap the mountain city, move back, grab a kill on that infantry right here, and I have to move back my tanks because he has a very nice defensive position, and I need to set up for stopping this center cap on the next turn. So I move up my tanks, get this recon position to potentially stop that cap, get my infantry into the mountains so that they're in defensive spots, but they can also start moving towards the center because I need more pressure in the center. And I go for a Neo-Tank here because I feel like that's one of my only options for finding an advantage over Jokas, because as long as I keep building 2 tanks every turn on my strong side, and he builds 2 tanks on his strong side every turn, I will always be down these 2 tanks that are the difference between the weak side tanks I have here and his weak side tank over here. They're both doing a similar job, but mine just is a 14k more investment. So I'm trying to find something to do now that I'm noticing oh, I cannot do anything with these tanks. Jokas' turn rolls in, and we are getting the copter over here as a defensive measure. But also, it's great because, as I said at the start, it's very flexible. You can use it as a defense on the weak side, but then you can also bring it into the center and have it make some plays. And because I went for the Neo-Tank here, there's probably going to be one turn where that copter is unanswered, and it can kind of get a free hit wherever it wants. So that's the trade-off of going for this Neo-Tank on this turn. I also went for the Neo-Tank additionally because I knew that Jokas would have 22,000 income. So to get a direct response of either a bomber or a Neo-Tank, he would need to double or triple base skip. So I kind of figured that by going for this Neo-Tank, he wouldn't have a response for one turn. So that's why an additional reason why I went for this. So here, I decided to go for attacks onto his infantry here with my own infantry, and then use the recon to help get an additional infantry kill. The reason being is that it avoids the power of this copter, so hopefully I can avoid a copter hit if he takes an engagement down here, and it's also playing around where my Neotank can most easily get into the combat. So hopefully I can get a Neotank hit if he engages onto this recon, and I can start a brawl. So I'm hoping that will work and he'll engage onto me there. Build my anti-air, and I build a copter. Because I see he doesn't have any anti-air yet, so I figure maybe the copter can get in some value somewhere. So going for the caps here, bringing the medium tank out, that will zone out all three of these tanks on the bottom side very easily without any need for infantry. Builds his own Neotank as a direct counter, which is always needed when you're facing a Neotank. You need to build a Neotank or a bomber in 99% of scenarios. So it's good that he has that counter now. Goes in for here, and this is another smart play that Jokas makes, is that he plays around this copter because he knows that it's going to be unanswered for one turn. So he goes for a cap that's within range of this copter, so that if I want to interrupt it, I need to take a free hit from that copter. So very smart play from there. And then builds up an infantry wall and has his tanks in very defensive positions, so I can't go for anything really devastating. So I go for a cap down here, bring my copter up, and I go for recon hit. And then here I go for infantry kills. So I really am at this point looking to break down those infantry walls so that I get much more favorable trades later on with vehicles, and there's many more avenues open. If you let Stally COs like Eagle and Olaf build up those infantry walls and you don't try to trade back and forth with infantry, it can be very problematic because you'll run into situations where you want to use your powers to get a lot of value, but you have to use the powers on infantry, and you typically want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So I'm trying to set up that situation for future turns. So being very aggressive with my infantry attacks. Bring my Neotank into position. I can place it wherever because there's nothing threatening it at the moment. And then I bring these three tanks as far up as I can without them being in danger of being attacked. And here I build a recon, which I don't think makes a lot of sense because an infantry would help me tech up to another unit next turn, and the recon here is falling into the same problem as the third tank here, where it's just cut off and it can't really do anything, and recons are only really great when you can find a lot of infantry hits to get off, or like there's like a lot of mechs in the area, but there's none of these conditions. It was just like an odd income curve where I had 6,600, and I just wanted a vehicle, but it doesn't make a lot of sense in this situation. So day 13 comes in, and Jokas decides to fight back into this infantry wall because it's pretty much near the center and definitely wants to get some value out of having this copter be unanswered. So it kind of forces, it creates a nice wall because it's hard to, you cannot kill this copter with anything on the board right now. Helps build a very strong wall because the max Neotank cannot one-shot a tank on a city. It would probably need a luck roll from an infantry. Moves up, make sure to interrupt this center cap. So day 14 is really where the game turns, because at this point, mentally, I'm really frustrated at this game, because I have these three tanks here that, as I've been talking about all game, are disconnected and really having a difficult time doing anything. So I'm always down in active tanks. So an active tank is something that can exert pressure and be useful on like the battlefield. So Jokas has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm down 2 tanks in the center solely because of overinvesting in the weak side. And this turn, I see that if I interrupt this cap here, I can kill off this 5 HP infantry, and there's a potential wraparound with these tanks with a max power, they would get one more range, and they could find some paths to kill off some of these tanks down here. So I decided to go for that because I really don't want to keep being in a situation where I'm down 2 tanks in the center. So go for this Neo tank here because this is a free hit. And then I hit there, and then that gives me enough power to go for a max force. And this tank really didn't have anything else to do besides hit an APC, so I guess I went for that. But the biggest problem with this play, going deep in and trying to get as much damage on his vehicles as possible, is that I very easily give Olaf a super. And this is exactly where Olaf wants to be when he pops a super, is that if we draw a line down the center of the map really poorly, we can see that all of my units are vastly overextended by like 3 or 4 squares. So when Olaf pops his powers, not only is he going to get a lot of grid kills, he gets 2 free kills with his Neo tank and his medium tank, because I can't respond to that. But he's also going to probably get a free copter hit, a free tank hit, a bunch of damaged units that'll probably get some decent chunks onto more weakened units. And on the following turn, he can then chase my units because of the snow. So it'll be really devastating. So, as expected, goes for the copter hit and the tank hit there to get the Winter's Fury, pops it, and now he can do a lot of damage. So, first off, he kills off all the infantry that are in this area that can stop this cap, and with the snow, my Neo tank can't reach, so this is going to be capped and I cannot stop it. So he will have an income lead on the following turn. Goes in with these 2 infantry to kill off the infantry that was on the city, and now I'm being threatened up here because there's now a tank up here threatening to kill off these infantry and then have another cap, and then I lose even more properties. And I can't really fight because of the snow. I can't take out these infantry. Goes in, gets those 2 free kills with his medium tank and his Neo tank, and then moves up his infantry to start blocking off positions. Day 15 comes in for me. I'm down 20,000 at this point, and I just felt so out of it at this point because I know that I'm going to be down in income against Olaf, and I'm down in unit value and like overall fighting potential. Like I just can't brawl into this, so I have to try and find, take some units out on the way out, but then I have to retreat. So I have to bring my Neo tank back to heal. And then on Jokas' turn, there's just a lot of good opportunities for him to get value. So first can get some infantry kills, and because of the snow and me being so overextended, he's able to very easily pick off a lot of free tank kills. And he doesn't posture forward with these teched up units. He uses them to defend because he understands he's up in value and that I have to come into him if I want to do anything. I have to respond to a lot of threats that are happening. There's now 2 tanks up here that are threatening that side, and I really can only respond with a Neo tank, so he can kind of wait for me to respond up there with a Neo tank and then pressure with more teched up units. He even goes for a double base skip Neo tank, which is really smart in my opinion because then he can really pressure, because I'll have 1 Neo tank that's forced up to deal with these 2 tanks, and then it'll be 1 Neo tank versus 2 Neo tanks in the medium. And yeah, there's nothing really I can do. I back off for 1 turn. He's able to take an income lead by 3,000 on the following turn, back off these 2 tanks once he sees a Neo tank coming in, and move towards the center. And then I resign, because there's nothing really more I can do from that point. Key points of this match. Very important first thing is that do not overinvest on weak, disconnected fronts. If there's a weak front that can potentially be shifted into being your strong front, feel free to invest into it. Feel free to respond to put a little bit of extra support into it every so often. But if it's a disconnected front like the one in A Hope Forlorn, it is much better to play reactively like Jokas did. Jokas had this one tank over on his weak side for so long, and because I never pressured it, that was all he really needed. If I brought two tanks up there at any point, I think it would have been pretty strong, but the problem I had with that was that because I invested into my own defense here, if I had brought two tanks from the center up to attack the top area, then I would have ceded the center. So, because I just would have so few tanks compared to his tanks that are all centralized, that it would have been a big problem. Another big problem that I had was that that day 14 power usage. I think a much better option is to take the Neotank hit that I did, and then move a tank up here to try and pressure the top, and shift much more into a top-focused game and shift back my tanks, because a lot of his infantry that could cap are weakened in the center, so there's less of a threat of losing those properties immediately. And a tank that attacks the tank up here will actually block the tank from retreating fully, and I can maybe start to get a lot of pressure over here. I've got a couple infantry that in 2 turns could threaten a cap on a city up here. I think it would just be a lot better to play it a little slower, and I think I got a little too aggravated at the mistake of building all these tanks at the bottom. There's also just a lot of smart positioning and smart use of income curves early by Jokas that made his builds a lot better and sort of forfeited a lot of the value that I had. This recon, while it does do some immediate work, and you can see the immediate value of preventing this city for 1 turn and forcing out a tank on the weak side, and then being able to like shift towards the center. Because I also built a tank on the weak side, I didn't have any pressure on the center to back up this. So not only were my income curves off, where I couldn't get those tanks out one after another, and I had that triple infantry build turn, I also just didn't, synchronize my units very well. This recon sort of hints that I want to do a lot of pressure in this area of the map, but if I don't have tanks to back up the recon pressure, the recon loses lots of value, and as the game moves on, the recon becomes a lot less valuable once there's a lot more tanks on the field. I think those are like the 3 biggest points. Jokas is also just really good at those very sharp plays. He takes a lot of time, definitely kind of a move planner person. And it was also very useful to get his feedback on this match and sort of where he thought he played the game, where the mistakes were, and how he capitalized on them. Because I'm definitely a lot more of a brawly player where I like to sort of smash vehicles into each other, but Standard is very objective focused. You can use your infantry to grab properties, play around smart movements of your units, and the investment you take into each front is very, very important. In Fog, most of your bases are connected together, so it doesn't really matter where you build from because you can kind of send them out anywhere you want. Generally, it may take a little bit longer, but most fronts are connected for the bases. But in the Hope Forlorn, I fell into the trap of building onto the weak side too much, and then it's basically like he killed off the tanks without doing anything. That's how I kind of view it. So hopefully you found this game very interesting. This is a really fun match to play, and I learned a lot from it, so I hope that you're able to do the same. And until next time, later.